The silver moonlight cast long shadows on the empty boardwalk, as Sophia Porter clutched her shawl tighter against the evening chill, the fabric catching on the raised welts across her forearms, permanent reminders of a marriage she'd barely survived. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to walk past the general store where whispers followed her like vultures circling dying prey. San Antonio, Texas, 1875, a place where Sophia had hoped to disappear, to start anew after fleeing her husband's ranch 50 miles north. Instead, she'd found that whispers traveled faster than stage coaches in these parts. "There she goes," came the predictable murmur from Mrs. Tillman on the store's porch. "Walking around like decent folk. Should cover those arms if she knows what's proper." Sophia kept her gaze forward, her spine rigid despite the urge to hunch her shoulders. 6 months in town, and the stares hadn't lessened. 6 months of working at Mrs. Bedford's boarding house, scrubbing floors and changing linens while enduring sidelong glances at the web of scars that peeked from beneath her sleeves whenever she reached for something on a high shelf. The boarding house stood at the edge of town, a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. Mrs. Bedford was a stern widow who asked few questions when Sophia had arrived, pale and trembling, with nothing but a small carpetbag and the clothes on her back. The woman had given her room and board in exchange for work, and for that, Sophia was grateful. "You're late," Mrs. Bedford said as Sophia entered through the kitchen door. The older woman stood at the stove stirring a pot of beans. "The Wilkerson brothers need fresh towels, and there's a new guest in room 4 who'll be wanting supper." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bedford, I had to wait at the post office." Sophia reached for her apron hanging on a hook by the door. "I'll see to the towels right away, Mrs." Bedford's eyes flickered to Sophia's arms as she rolled up her sleeves. The woman said nothing, but her pinched expression spoke volumes. Sophia had learned to ignore such looks. She gathered clean towels from the linen closet and headed upstairs. The boarding house was quiet this evening, most guests either still out for supper or already settled in their rooms. She knocked lightly on the Wilkerson brothers' door, left the towels when no one answered, then made her way to room 4. She paused outside the door, took a steadying breath, and knocked. "Housekeeping. I've brought fresh towels." "Come in," called a deep voice. Sophia opened the door to find a tall man standing by the window, his hat in his hands. He turned as she entered, and Sophia was struck by eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, worn denim pants, and boots that had seen many miles, not the flashy attire of a gambler or the pressed suit of a traveling salesman. This man was different. "Good evening, madam," he said, placing his hat on the bedpost. "Much obliged for the towels." His gaze met hers directly, with none of the uncomfortable shifting she'd grown accustomed to. When his eyes did move, they didn't linger on her scars but seemed to take in all of her at once. "Will you be taking supper downstairs, sir?" she asked, placing the towels on the washstand. "I reckon I will," he smiled, a slight lifting at the corners of his mouth. "Name's Matthew Stone. I'll be staying a few days while I look for work, Mrs. Bedford serves at 6 sharp, Sophia said, moving toward the door. "And your name, miss?" he asked. She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. Few guests bothered to ask her name. "Sophia Porter," he nodded, as if committing it to memory. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Porter." Sophia hurried downstairs, unsettled by the encounter. Not because Mr. Stone had been impolite, quite the opposite. His direct gaze and easy manner had caught her off guard. For the past 2 years, 1 year, trapped in marriage to Gerald Porter, and 6 months since her escape, she'd grown used to being either invisible or an object of pity and scorn. At 6 o'clock, She helped Mrs. Bedford serve supper to the guests gathered around the long oak table in the dining room. There were the Wilkerson brothers, cattle buyers passing through on their way to Austin, Mr. Finch, the traveling salesman who had been staying at the boarding house for nearly 2 weeks, Miss Harriet Cook, the new schoolteacher, and now Mr. Stone. Sophia kept her eyes downcast as she placed a bowl of stew in front of each guest, careful to keep her scarred arms close to her body. When she reached Mr. Stone, she felt his gaze on her face rather than her arms. She glanced up involuntarily and found him watching her with curious eyes. "Thank you, Miss Porter," he said. "You're welcome, sir," she replied, moving quickly to the next guest. The conversation around the table flowed without her, as it always did. She was part of the furniture, expected to serve and then fade into the background. She was accustomed to this role, preferred it even. Invisibility meant safety. After supper, she cleared the dishes while Mrs. Bedford brought out apple pie. The guests lingered over dessert and coffee, their voices rising and falling in the warm room. Sophia worked silently in the kitchen, washing dishes and preparing for breakfast the next morning. She was wiping down the kitchen table when Mr. Stone appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Excuse me, Miss Porter," he said. "That was a fine meal. Please extend my compliments to Mrs. Bedford." Sophia nodded, surprised at his presence in the kitchen, a space reserved for staff, not guests. "I'll tell her, Mr. Stone." He seemed about to say more but nodded instead and turned to go. At the doorway he paused. "Good night, Miss Porter." "Good night, Mr. Stone," she replied. Later, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her small attic room, Sophia found herself thinking about the new guest. There was something about Matthew Stone that unsettled her, not in the way Gerald had, with his quick temper and cruel hands. No, this was different. It was the way he looked at her, as if truly seeing her in her room. Sophia lit a small candle and sat on the edge of her narrow bed. She rolled up her sleeves and examined the scars that crisscrossed her forearms. Gerald had been creative in his cruelty, using his belt, a riding crop, once even a heated poker when she'd burned his dinner. The worst scars were on her back, but these visible ones on her arms were what the town saw, what they judged. She traced a finger along one particularly vivid scar that ran from her wrist halfway to her elbow. That had been from the night she decided to leave. Gerald had caught her packing a small bag, his face contorted with rage as he grabbed the nearest object, a letter opener, and lunged. She'd raised her arm in defense, and the blade had sliced deep. That same night, while Gerald lay in a drunken stupor, she had fled, 50 miles on foot, hiding during the day, traveling at night before she reached San Antonio. She had chosen the city because of its size, hoping to lose herself among the many faces. Instead, she'd found that people noticed what was different, what was marked. Sophia blew out the candle and lay back on her thin mattress. Tomorrow would be another day of work, of downcast eyes and whispers. But for the first time in months, she found herself curious about what the new day might bring. Morning came with the clatter of pots in the kitchen below, and the smell of coffee wafting up to her attic room. Sophia dressed quickly in her simple brown dress, pinned her hair in a neat bun, and headed downstairs to help with breakfast. The dining room was already half full when she entered with a pot of coffee. Mr. Finch and Miss Cook sat at one end of the table, deep in conversation. The Wilkerson brothers occupied their usual spots, arguing good-naturedly about a horse they'd seen in the livery stable. Mr. Stone sat alone at the far end, a newspaper spread before him. Sophia moved around the table, filling coffee cups, careful to keep her arms close to her body. When she reached Mr. Stone, he folded the newspaper and looked up with a smile. "Good morning, Miss Porter," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," she replied, pouring his coffee. "I hear there's work to be had at the Rockingham Ranch," said one of the Wilkerson brothers, addressing Mr. Stone. "They're looking for experienced hands." Mr. Stone nodded. "Appreciate the tip. I aim to head out there today." "You've worked cattle before?" asked the other Wilkerson. "Most of my life," Mr. Stone replied. "Grew up on a ranch in Colorado, been working my way south since the war." "The war." Sophia paused in her task. Mr. Stone didn't look old enough to have fought in the Civil War, but then again, many boys had lied about their age to enlist. It would make him around 30, she guessed, a few years older than she had first thought. After breakfast, she was sweeping the front porch when Mr. Stone emerged from the boarding house, dressed in work clothes with a worn leather vest over his shirt. He settled his hat on his head and nodded to her as he passed. "Hope you have a good day, Miss Porter," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Stone." "Good luck with your job search," she replied, her hands tightening on the broom handle. He paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back at her. "Luck's got little to do with it. Hard work and honesty, that's what counts in the end." With that, he turned and walked toward the livery stable at the end of the street. Sophia watched him go, his tall figure moving easily through the morning crowd on the boardwalk. "That one's got his eye on you," said Mrs. Bedford from the doorway, making Sophia start. "Best be careful, girl. Men like that drifters, they don't stay." "I wasn't," Sophia began, but Mrs. Bedford had already gone back inside. Sophia returned to her sweeping, her cheeks warm. She wasn't interested in Mr. Stone or any man, for that matter. Gerald had cured her of any romantic notions she might have harbored. Men were not to be trusted, especially charming ones with kind smiles and direct gazes. Later that morning, she walked to the general store for supplies Mrs. Bedford needed. The store was busy. Townspeople gathered around the pot-bellied stove despite the warm spring day, exchanging news and gossip. Sophia kept her head down as she handed Mr. Olson, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Bedford's list. She was acutely aware of the stares and whispers as she waited for him to gather the items. "Did you hear about the Porter woman?" came a voice from near the stove. Mrs. Tillman, of course. The woman never missed an opportunity to spread gossip. "Living at Bedford's boarding house like she's respectable folk." "What about her?" asked another woman. "Her husband's looking for her," Mrs. Tillman said, her voice carrying clearly across the store. "Put out word all the way to Austin. Says she stole from him before she ran off." Sophia's heart stuttered in her chest. Gerald was looking for her. The knowledge settled like ice in her stomach. "Can't imagine why he'd want her back," said a man's voice. "Marked up like that, must have done something to deserve it." Laughter followed, and Sophia fought the urge to flee the store. Instead, she stood rigid, her eyes fixed on the counter as Mr. Olson slowly assembled her order. "That'll be $1.45, he said finally, not meeting her eyes. Sophia counted out the coins with trembling fingers, gathered the packages, and turned to leave. The group by the stove fell silent as she passed, their eyes following her to the door. Outside, she took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to calm her racing heart. Gerald was looking for her. He was telling people she had stolen from him a lie, but one that would give him legal grounds to reclaim her. As his wife, she was his property under the law if he found her. "Miss Porter." She jumped at the voice, nearly dropping her packages. Matthew Stone stood before her, concern evident in his blue eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked. "You look pale as a ghost." "I'm fine," she said automatically, clutching the packages tighter. He glanced at the store behind her, then back to her face. "Let me help you with those." Before she could protest, he had taken the heaviest packages from her arms. "I was heading back to the boarding house myself," he said. "Got the job at the Rockingham starting tomorrow." Sophia nodded, unable to find words. They walked in silence for a few moments, the busy street around them a blur to her distracted mind. "Don't pay them no mind," Mr. Stone said suddenly. "I beg your pardon," she asked, glancing up at him. "The folks in the store. I heard them as I was coming in." His jaw tightened. "Small minds, Miss Porter. That's all they are." She looked away, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "You shouldn't concern yourself with it, Mr. Stone." "Reckon I'll concern myself with whatever I please," he replied, his tone light despite the set of his jaw. "And I don't much like hearing decent folks talked about in such a way." Decent folks. The words echoed in her mind. It had been a long time since anyone had referred to her as decent. They reached the boarding house, and he followed her to the kitchen, setting the packages on the table. "Mrs. Bedford looked up from her cooking, raising an eyebrow at the sight of them together. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Stone," Sophia said formally, aware of Mrs. Bedford's watchful gaze. He tipped his hat. "My pleasure, Miss Porter." With a nod to Mrs. Bedford, he left the kitchen. "What was that about?" Mrs. Bedford asked as soon as he was gone. "He was just being kind," Sophia replied, unpacking the supplies. Mrs. Bedford humphed. "Men like that aren't kind without reason. Mind yourself, girl." Sophia said nothing, continuing her work, but Mrs. Bedford's warning coming on the heels of the news about Gerald left her feeling more unsettled than ever. That evening, as she served supper, she felt Mr. Stone's eyes on her more than once. Not the uncomfortable stares she was accustomed to, but something more thoughtful, more assessing. When their eyes met briefly, he offered a small smile that she couldn't bring herself to return. After the meal, as she cleared the dishes, Mr. Stone approached her in the kitchen. "Miss Porter," he said, his voice low, "I couldn't help but overhear what they said in the store today. About your husband looking for you." Sophia froze, a plate in her hands. "It's none of your concern, Mr. Stone." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I also heard you might be in some trouble if he finds you." She set the plate down carefully, turned to face him. "What do you want, Mr. Stone?" He looked startled by the direct question. "Want? Nothing, miss. I just thought. If you needed help, I don't," she interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "Thank you for your concern, but I can manage my own affairs." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But if you change your mind, my offer stands." After he left, Sophia leaned against the sink, her heart pounding. She didn't need his help or his pity. She'd escaped Gerald once. She could do it again if necessary. But where would she go this time? With no money saved and Gerald spreading lies about theft, she might be arrested if she tried to flee. Over the next week, Matthew Stone settled into a routine. He would leave early for the Rockingham Ranch and return in time for supper. Dusty and tired, but always with a smile and a polite word for everyone, especially Sophia. Despite her initial wariness, she found herself watching for his return, listening for his deep voice in the dining room. It was on a Saturday, her half-day off, when everything changed. Sophia had walked to the small lending library near the church, one of the few places in town where she felt somewhat comfortable. The librarian, Mrs. Hanson, was elderly and nearsighted, more interested in books than gossip. She was returning to the boarding house, a borrowed copy of Jane Eyre tucked under her arm, when she saw him. Gerald Porter stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, talking to Sheriff Williams. Her husband looked much as she remembered him, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair slicked back, his clothes expensive. At 35, Gerald had the prosperous look of a successful rancher, hiding the cruel nature beneath a veneer of respectability. Sophia ducked into the nearest shop, a millinery store, her heart racing. Through the window, she watched as Gerald shook hands with the sheriff and strolled down the boardwalk, pausing to speak to people along the way. He was searching for her, she knew, asking questions, showing perhaps a small portrait she hadn't known existed. She waited until Gerald entered the hotel across the street before slipping out of the shop and hurrying toward the boarding house. Her mind raced. She needed to leave immediately. But where would she go? How far would she have to run this time? Lost in her panicked thoughts, she didn't see the group of women until she was almost upon them. Mrs. Tillman stood with 3 other ladies from her sewing circle, blocking the boardwalk. "Well, look who it is, Mrs. Tillman said loudly. The runaway wife herself. Sophia tried to step around them, but they shifted to block her path. "Your husband's in town looking for you," said one of the women, her eyes gleaming with malicious interest. "Handsome man. Can't imagine why you'd run from him." "Probably because of those marks," said another, eyeing Sophia's arms with distaste. "Must have done something terrible to deserve that kind of punishment." "Please," Sophia said quietly, "let me pass, Mrs. Tillman reached out and grabbed Sophia's wrist, pushing up her sleeve to expose the worst of the scars. "Look at that. Like an animal that's been branded. What kind of woman let her go?" The command came from behind Sophia. She turned to see Matthew Stone standing there, his expression hard as he looked at Mrs. Tillman's hand on Sophia's wrist. Mrs. Tillman released her grip, but her expression remained smug. "Just having a friendly chat, Mr. Stone. Nothing to concern yourself with." "Didn't look friendly to me," he replied, moving to stand beside Sophia. "Miss Porter, Mrs. Bedford was looking for you." It was a lie Sophia knew, but she was grateful for it. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. I was just heading back." The women parted reluctantly, allowing Sophia and Matthew to pass. She could feel their eyes boring into her back as they walked away. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly once they were out of earshot. "Yes," she said automatically, then corrected herself. "No, my husband is in town." Matthew's stride faltered slightly. "The man who did that to you." He nodded toward her arms. She nodded, unable to speak past the fear closing her throat. "You can't stay at the boarding house," he said. "It's the first place he'll look." "I know," she whispered, "but I have nowhere else to go." They had reached a small park at the edge of town, deserted in the late afternoon heat. Matthew guided her to a bench beneath a cottonwood tree out of sight of the main street. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it." Sophia hesitated, years of keeping her secrets close warring with the desperate need to trust someone. Finally, she began to speak, her voice low and steady. "I was 18 when I married Gerald Porter. My parents had died, and I was living with an uncle who saw me as nothing but a burden. Gerald was charming, wealthy, and seemed kind. He courted me for 3 months before proposing." She paused, remembering the hopeful young woman she had been. "The first year was good. He was attentive, generous. Then things changed." She told him about the first time Gerald had hit her a slap across the face for speaking to another man at church. How he had apologized afterward, bringing her flowers and promising it would never happen again. How the violence had escalated gradually, becoming more frequent and more severe. "He was careful at first," she said. "The marks were where no one could see. Then he grew bolder. Or perhaps he just stopped caring who saw, who knew." She described the isolation of the ranch, miles from the nearest neighbor, how Gerald had gradually cut her off from any friends she had made. How he controlled every aspect of her life, what she wore, what she ate, when she spoke. "The night I left," she continued, "he had been drinking more heavily than usual. He was angry about a deal that had fallen through, blamed me for bringing bad luck. He used a letter opener on my arm when I tried to defend myself." She touched the long scar on her forearm. "When he passed out, I took what little money I could find and ran. I walked for days, hiding during daylight, traveling at night. I had nothing but the clothes on my back when I reached San Antonio. Matthew listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, staring out at the empty park. "You're not going back to him," he said finally, his voice hard with certainty. "I have no choice," she replied. "He'll find me eventually, and the law is on his side. I'm his wife." "There's always a choice," Matthew said. He turned to face her fully. "I'm heading back to the ranch now. Pack whatever you can carry and meet me at the livery stable at midnight. I know a place where you can hide until we figure something more permanent." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, searching his face for hidden motives. "Because those scars," he said, his gaze dropping briefly to her arms, "they don't tell me you're damaged or marked or whatever nonsense those women were spewing. Those scars only prove your strength. You survived, Sophia, and you deserve the chance to keep on surviving." The raw honesty in his voice brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to appear weak when he had just called her strong. "I'll meet you at midnight," she said. True to her word, Sophia slipped out of the boarding house at 5 minutes to midnight, a small bundle containing her few possessions clutched to her chest. The town was quiet, most establishments closed except for the saloon, from which piano music and raucous laughter spilled into the night. She kept to the shadows, her heart pounding with each step. If Gerald had posted men to watch for her, if someone saw her and reported back to him. The livery stable was dark when she approached, but a soft whistle from the side door signaled Matthew's presence. She hurried toward the sound, relief washing over her as she saw his familiar outline. "You came," he said, taking her bundle. "Did you think I wouldn't?" she asked. "Wasn't sure," he admitted. "It's a big risk you're taking, trusting a man you barely know." "Staying would be a bigger risk," she replied. He nodded and led her into the stable where 2 saddled horses waited. "Ever ridden before?" he asked. "Yes, though it's been some time," she said. "This is Daisy," he said, indicating a gentle-looking bay mare. "She'll take good care of you." With his help, Sophia mounted the mare, arranging her skirts as best she could. Matthew secured her bundle behind the saddle, then mounted his own horse, a sturdy black gelding. "We'll ride east," he said. "There's a line shack about 4 hours' ride from here, on the far edge of the Rockingham property. Old foreman says no one's used it for years." They left town quietly, keeping to back streets until they reached open country. Once beyond the town limits, Matthew set a steady pace, not too fast but persistent. Sophia adjusted to the rhythm of the horse beneath her, memories of childhood rides with her father returning as her body remembered the motions. They rode in silence for the most part, the moonlight casting enough light to see the trail. Sophia's mind raced with questions and fears. What if Gerald tracked her to the boarding house? What if he hurt Mrs. Bedford or the other guests trying to find her? What if this plan of Matthew's didn't work? As if sensing her thoughts, Matthew spoke, his voice carrying easily in the quiet night. "He won't find you, and even if he does, he'll have to go through me first." "You don't know Gerald," she said. "He's dangerous when crossed." "I've faced dangerous men before," Matthew replied. There was something in his tone that made Sophia believe him. The line shack appeared just before dawn, a small structure nestled against a grove of trees near a creek. It was simple, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung in corners, but it was solid and, most importantly, hidden. Matthew helped Sophia dismount, then saw to the horses while she explored their temporary refuge. Despite the dust and neglect, the shack felt safer than anywhere she had been in the past 2 years. "It's not much," Matthew said as he entered, carrying her bundle and his own saddlebags, "but it'll do for now." "It's perfect," she replied honestly. He built a small fire in the fireplace, careful to use only dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. From his saddlebags, he produced jerky, biscuits, and a tin of coffee. "Not exactly a feast," he said apologetically as he prepared the coffee. "It's more than I expected," she said, sitting on the edge of the cot. Now that they had stopped moving, exhaustion washed over her, making her limbs heavy. Matthew seemed to notice. "You should rest. I'll keep watch." She wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't tired, but the events of the day had drained her. Without argument, she lay down on the cot, pulling her shawl around her for warmth. "Matthew," she said as he moved toward the door, "thank you." He paused, looked back at her with a slight smile. "Get some sleep, Sophia." She did, falling into a deeper slumber than she had experienced in years, the sound of Matthew moving quietly around the cabin a comforting backdrop to her dreams. When she woke, sunlight streamed through the single window. Matthew sat at the table, cleaning a revolver with practiced movements. He looked up as she stirred. "Good morning," he said. "Or afternoon, more like. You slept a solid 8 hours." She sat up, embarrassed. "You should have woken me." "You needed the rest," he said simply, returning the revolver to its holster. "There's coffee if you want it and some jerky. I'll see about getting proper supplies soon." Sophia accepted the tin cup he offered, the strong black coffee bitter but welcome. "What happens now?" she asked after taking a sip. "Now we wait," Matthew said. "I need to get back to the ranch today, can't risk losing the job when we need the money, but I'll bring supplies when I return tonight. And then," he considered her question, "and then we figure out a more permanent solution. You can't stay in Texas, not with him looking for you. Maybe we head north or west to the territories." She repeated. Matthew met her gaze steadily. "Unless you'd rather go alone." "No," she said quickly. I don't understand why you're doing this, risking your job, your reputation." He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing a pattern on the table. "When I was in the war," he said finally, "I saw a lot of cruelty, men doing terrible things to each other in the name of causes they barely understood. After, I swore I'd never stand by and watch suffering if I could help it." He looked up at her. "And maybe I recognize something in you, Sophia, a kind of courage I've always admired." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her, a part she had thought long dead after years of Gerald's abuse. She looked away, uncertain how to respond to such honesty. "I should go," he said, standing. "I'll be back after sundown. Bar the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me. I'll whistle 3 notes like last night so you'll know it's me." After he left, Sophia secured the door as instructed and set about making the shack more habitable. She swept away cobwebs, wiped dust from surfaces, and arranged her few possessions neatly on a shelf. The physical activity helped quiet her mind, pushing away thoughts of Gerald and the precarious nature of her situation. By late afternoon, the shack was as clean as she could make it with limited supplies. She sat on the cot, opened her borrowed copy of Jane Eyre, and lost herself in the familiar story of a woman who had also fled an impossible situation. She was so absorbed in her reading that the sound of approaching horses came as a shock. Dropping the book, she moved to the window, her heart pounding. 3 riders approached the shack, none of them Matthew. One, to her horror, was Gerald. Sophia backed away from the window, panic clawing at her throat. How had he found her so quickly? Had Matthew betrayed her? No, she couldn't believe that. More likely Gerald had heard about Matthew helping her in town and had followed his trail from the ranch. The sound of boots on the porch, then a heavy knock at the door. "Sophia," came Gerald's voice, falsely pleasant. "I know you're in there, darling. Open the door." She remained silent, pressed against the far wall of the shack. "Sophia," he called again, his tone hardening. "Don't make this difficult. You're my wife. You belong at home with me." Still she said nothing, her eyes darting around the cabin for a weapon, an escape route, anything. The revolver Matthew had been cleaning was gone, taken with him. There was a knife on the table used for the jerky. She moved silently toward it. "Break it down," Gerald ordered someone. A heavy thud against the door, then another. The wood began to splinter around the simple lock. Sophia gripped the knife, knowing it would offer little protection but unwilling to surrender without a fight. The door gave way with a crack, and Gerald stepped into the shack, flanked by two men she didn't recognize, hired guns, most likely. Her husband looked much as he had the day before, impeccably dressed, his expression a mask of concern that didn't reach his cold eyes. "There you are," he said, as if finding her after a brief separation. "You've led me on quite a chase, my dear." "Leave me alone, Gerald," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not coming back with you," he sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice. You're my wife. The law is quite clear on this matter." He gestured to the men behind him. "These gentlemen are here to ensure you return home safely." "She's not going anywhere with you." The voice came from outside. Matthew stood in the doorway, his revolver drawn and pointed at Gerald's back. Gerald turned slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to contempt as he took in Matthew's dusty clothes and weather-beaten face. "And who might you be?" "The man who's telling you to leave," Matthew said, his voice calm but his eyes hard. Gerald laughed, a sound that sent shivers down Sophia's spine. "You're interfering in a private matter, Cowboy. This woman is my wife and I'm taking her home." "She's not your property," Matthew said. "She's a person who's made her choice, and that choice is to leave you." Gerald's smile faded. "One man against three. Those aren't odds I'd bet on." "I only need one bullet for you," Matthew replied. "Your hired guns might reconsider their loyalty when they see you fall." The tension in the small cabin was palpable. Sophia gripped the knife tighter, her eyes fixed on Gerald's back. She knew her husband well enough to know he wouldn't back down easily, especially not in front of witnesses. "Lower your gun," Gerald said, his voice dangerously soft. "Walk away and I might forget I saw you." "Not happening," Matthew said. Gerald's hand moved toward his coat, where Sophia knew he kept a small derringer. "Last chance, Cowboy." Everything happened at once. Gerald reached for his hidden weapon. Matthew fired, the shot deafening in the small space. Gerald staggered, clutching his shoulder as blood spread across his expensive coat. One of the hired guns drew his weapon, but Matthew was faster, shifting his aim and firing again. The man dropped his gun, howling as he grabbed his wounded hand. The second hired gun raised his hands in surrender. "Get him out of here," Matthew ordered the unwounded man, nodding toward Gerald, who had sunk to his knees, his face pale with shock and pain. "This isn't over," Gerald gasped as the man helped him to his feet. "She's still my wife." "Not for long," Matthew said. "Now go, before I decide one bullet wasn't enough." The three men staggered out, the unwounded hired gun supporting Gerald while the other followed, still clutching his injured hand. Matthew watched from the doorway until they mounted their horses and rode away, then turned to Sophia. "Are you all right?" he asked, holstering his revolver. She nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. The knife slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. Matthew crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. She stiffened at first, unaccustomed to gentle touches, then gradually relaxed against him, her face pressed to his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. "I thought," she began. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. One of the hands mentioned Gerald Porter asking about me at the ranch. I left as soon as I heard." She pulled back slightly to look up at him. "You shot him." "In the shoulder," Matthew confirmed, He'll live, more's the pity. He won't stop, she said. He'll come back with more men or the law. Which is why we need to leave, Matthew replied. Tonight, I've got supplies and money enough to get us to Colorado, maybe farther if needed. Us? She questioned again. He looked down at her, his expression serious. If you'll have me as your traveling companion, I won't pretend it's just about helping you anymore, Sophia. These past days, I've come to care for you. The admission stunned her. After Gerald, after the town's whispers and stares, the idea that someone could see past her scars to the woman beneath seemed impossible. And yet, the truth of his words was written in his eyes. I don't know if I can. She began. I'm not asking for promises, he said quickly. Just a chance to prove that not all men are like him, that you deserve kindness, respect. He smiled slightly. And maybe someday, more than that. Sophia thought of the life she had fled, of the months in San Antonio trying to build something new while carrying the visible reminders of her past. She thought of Matthew's steady presence, his unwavering support since the moment he had defended her on the boardwalk. Colorado, she said finally. I've never been to Colorado. His smile broadened. It's beautiful. Mountains so high they touch the clouds, valleys so green you'd think you were in paradise. When do we leave? She asked. As soon as it's dark, he said. Can you be ready by then? She glanced around the small shack that had briefly been her refuge. I don't have much to prepare. They left shortly after nightfall, riding north under a canopy of stars. Matthew had brought supplies, food, water, blankets, ammunition, and a plan. They would ride through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Gerald, then rest during the hottest part of the day before continuing their journey. For 3 days they traveled this way, sleeping in brief shifts, always alert for pursuit. They avoided towns and main trails, Matthew's knowledge of the Texas backcountry guiding them through little-used paths and natural corridors. On the 4th day, they crossed into Indian Territory, what would later become Oklahoma. Here, Gerald's influence would be weaker, the laws of Texas less easily enforced. They made camp near a small creek, allowing themselves the luxury of a fire for the first time since leaving the line shack. As they sat beside the fire, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Sophia found herself studying Matthew's profile in the flickering light. The past days of hard travel had revealed much about his character, his patience, his resourcefulness, his quiet strength. He never complained about the pace or conditions, never mentioned the job and prospects he had left behind in San Antonio. Tell me about Colorado, she said as they finished their meal. Matthew looked up with a smile. What do you want to know? Everything. Your home, your family, what it was like growing up there. He set his plate aside and leaned back against his saddle. I grew up on a small ranch near a town called Durango in the southwestern part of the territory. My pa was a hard man but fair. Taught me everything I know about horses and cattle. Ma was gentle, always had a book in her hands when the chores were done. You have their qualities, Sophia observed. Your father's knowledge, your mother's gentleness. His smile softened. That's about the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. It's true, she insisted. I've watched you these past days. The way you care for the horses, how you're always aware of our surroundings but never tense or fearful. The war taught me that, he said, his expression growing distant. To stay alert without letting fear take over. Fear makes men stupid, dangerous. Like Gerald, she said quietly. Matthew nodded. Men like your husband, they're afraid deep down, afraid of losing control, afraid of being seen as weak. So they hurt others to feel strong. Is that why you never? She hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. Never hurt a woman, he finished for her. My pa would have thrashed me if I'd even thought of raising my hand to a female. A man who hits a woman is no man at all, he used to say. They fell silent. The crackling of the fire and distant night sounds the only interruption to the quiet. Sophia found herself relaxing, truly relaxing, for the first time in years. The constant tension she had carried in her shoulders, her neck, began to ease. "What about your family?" Matthew asked after a while. "You mentioned your parents died." "When I was 16, she confirmed. "Influenza took them both within a week of each other. My uncle, my father's brother, took me in, but he made it clear I was a burden. He was eager to see me married, especially to someone as wealthy as Gerald." "Did he know?" Matthew asked. "About how Gerald treated you?" Sophia shook her head. "I never told him. We weren't close, and after the wedding, Gerald made sure I had little contact with anyone from my past." She paused, remembering. "Besides, who would have believed me? Gerald was respected, influential. I was just a girl with no family, no money." "I would have believed you," Matthew said softly. She looked up, met his gaze across the fire. "I know you would have." The next day, they continued north, entering Kansas. The landscape changed, open prairie stretching to the horizon in all directions. They passed farms and small settlements but kept their distance, still wary of pursuers or lawmen who might have been alerted to look for them. It was in a small creek where they had stopped to water the horses that Sophia first noticed the change in herself. Kneeling by the water's edge, she caught sight of her reflection, her face thinner than before, tanned by days in the sun, but her eyes were different. The fear that had lived in them for so long had receded, replaced by something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. She looked up to find Matthew watching her, a question in his expression. "I was just thinking," she said, "how different I feel. Even just a week ago, I couldn't imagine a life without looking over my shoulder, without the weight of Gerald's shadow. And now," he asked, "now I'm starting to believe it's possible." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "That I could have a life that's mine, not defined by him or what he did to me." Matthew smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That's all I wanted for you from the beginning, to see you free." They rode on, the days blending together in a rhythm of travel and rest. They talked more openly now, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams before life had intervened. Sophia learned that Matthew had planned to take over his father's ranch before the war, that he had a younger sister who had married a shopkeeper in Denver, that he could recite passages of Shakespeare from memory, thanks to his book-loving mother. In turn, she told him about her love of painting, a hobby Gerald had forbidden as a waste of time. She described the garden she had tended as a girl, the dog she had rescued from a stream and raised to adulthood, the dreams she had harbored of seeing the ocean someday. 2 weeks into their journey, they reached Colorado territory. The mountains rose before them, majestic and imposing, unlike anything Sophia had ever seen. They stopped on a rise overlooking the landscape, both of them silent with the beauty of it. "Welcome to Colorado," Matthew said finally, his voice carrying a note of pride. "What do you think?" "It's magnificent," she breathed. "I never imagined. Pictures don't do it justice." "My family's ranch is 3 days' ride from here," he said. "It's not much compared to Gerald's spread, but it's good land." "Your family?" she asked, suddenly nervous. "They're expecting us." "I sent a telegram from that last town," he admitted. "Told them I was bringing someone special home, special." The word warmed her despite her apprehension. "What if they don't approve? A woman with scars running from her husband." "My folks aren't like the people in San Antonio," he assured her. "They judge a person by their character, not their past or their appearance." They made camp that night in a sheltered valley, the mountains rising around them like protective sentinels. As they prepared their simple meal, a routine they had perfected over the past weeks, Sophia found herself watching Matthew, noting the easy confidence of his movements, the way the firelight caught in his hair. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her gaze. "That I'm grateful," she said honestly, "for everything you've done, everything you've risked for me." He shook his head. "You don't owe me gratitude, Sophia. You would have found your way without me." "No," she said, certain of this if nothing else. "I wouldn't have. I was trapped, not just by Gerald but by my own fear, my own belief that I deserved what happened to me." "You never deserved it," he said fiercely. "I know that now." She moved closer to him, hesitant but determined. "Because of you, you saw strength in me when I could only see shame." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a tension that had been building since that first day in the boarding house. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Matthew reached out and took her hand. "Sophia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know something. What I feel for you. It's not pity and it's not some knightly desire to rescue a damsel. It's real and it's deep and it grows stronger every day." The words she had feared for so long, but coming from his lips, they held no terror, only promise. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his in a tentative kiss. He responded with gentle pressure, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. When they parted, his eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of hesitation or regret. "I'm not sure I know how to be loved," she confessed. "Gerald made me believe I was unlovable, that the scars he gave me were proof of my unworthiness." "Those scars only prove your strength," Matthew said, echoing his words from that day in the park. "They show that you survived, that you're stronger than whatever tried to break you." She believed him, not just the words but the sentiment behind them. For the first time since Gerald had shown his true nature, Sophia felt worthy of affection, of tenderness, of love. "I think I could learn," she said softly. "With time. With you." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "We have all the time in the world." They reached the Stone family ranch 3 days later, as Matthew had predicted. It was smaller than Gerald's spread, but beautiful in its own right, a sturdy main house with a wide porch, a well-kept barn grazing land that stretched to the foothills of the mountains. An older woman emerged from the house as they approached, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She was tall and straight-backed, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun, her dress simple but well-made. "Matthew," she called, hurrying down the porch steps. "Ma," he returned, dismounting quickly and catching her in an embrace that lifted her off her feet. Sophia hung back, suddenly unsure of her welcome despite Matthew's assurances. She watched as a man emerged from the barn, Matthew's father, she guessed, seeing the resemblance in the set of his shoulders and the shape of his jaw. "So you finally decided to come home," the older man said, his gruff tone belied by the warmth in his eyes as he clasped his son's hand. "Had good reason to stay away, better reason to return," Matthew replied, turning toward Sophia. "Ma, Pa, this is Sophia Porter, Mrs." Stone approached, her kind eyes taking in Sophia's travel-worn appearance without judgment. "Welcome, my dear. Matthew's letter said you'd be joining him. We've been looking forward to meeting you." "Thank you for having me," Sophia said, fighting the urge to hide her scarred arms, visible in the short-sleeved dress she had purchased at their last stop. If Mrs. Stone noticed the scars, she gave no indication. "You must be exhausted from your journey. Come inside, both of you. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread cooling." Mr. Stone took charge of the horses, waving away Matthew's offer to help. "Go on with your ma and your lady. Horses can wait. Hungry travelers can't." Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, with hand-braided rugs on the floors and colorful quilts draped over well-worn furniture. It smelled of home cooking and clean linens, and the faint scent of pine from the logs in the fireplace. Mrs. Stone ushered them to a table already set for four, then bustled about serving generous bowls of stew and slices of fresh bread slathered with butter. Mr. Stone joined them shortly, having seen to the horses. The meal passed in easy conversation, Matthew filling his parents in on his travels since his last letter, carefully editing the more dangerous aspects of their journey. His parents listened attentively, asking occasional questions but never prying. After supper, Mrs. Stone showed Sophia to a small but comfortable guest room. "You rest now," she said. "Tomorrow's soon enough for getting to know each other better." Alone in the room, Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the events of the past weeks, from prisoner in her own marriage to fugitive to. What was she to Matthew, to his family? What would her life look like here in this new place with these new people? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Sophia," came Matthew's voice. "May I come in?" "Yes," she called, standing as the door opened. He entered, closing the door partway behind him, propriety observed but privacy afforded. "How are you settling in?" "Your parents are very kind," she said. "They like you," he replied with a smile. "Pa doesn't usually take to strangers so quick, but he said you have honest eyes." She laughed softly. "High praise, I take it, the highest." He moved closer, taking her hands in his. "I meant to give you more time, Sophia, time to adjust, to be sure of your feelings, but seeing you here in my family's home." He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "I don't want to wait any more." "For what?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer, hoped for it even. "To ask you to be my wife," he said simply. "Not like before, not a matter of possession or control, a partnership, equals building a life together." Joy bloomed in her chest, so intense it was almost painful. "But I'm still married to Gerald," she reminded him. "In the eyes of the law, at least." "We can solve that," he said confidently. "There are lawyers in Denver who can help with divorce proceedings, especially in cases like yours. And Gerald has no power here, no influence." She considered his words, the practical obstacles and the deeper fears. "Are you sure, Matthew? The scars, they won't fade, and there might be other marks, invisible ones that take longer to heal." "I'm sure about you," he said. "Everything else, we'll face together." She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt and finding none. This man who had risked everything for her, who saw beauty where others saw only damage, who believed in her strength when she had forgotten it herself, this man loved her. And she, against all odds, loved him in return. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Matthew Stone. When I'm free to do so, I will be your wife." His smile lit up his entire face. He drew her close, kissed her with a tenderness that held the promise of passion, of a lifetime of such moments. "I love you, Sophia," he whispered against her lips. "I love you too," she replied, the words no longer frightening but liberating. The legal process of ending her marriage to Gerald took nearly a year. Matthew accompanied her to Denver multiple times, supporting her through meetings with lawyers and court appearances. Gerald contested the divorce at first, more out of pride than genuine desire to reclaim her. But faced with testimony about his cruelty from former servants brave enough to speak out, and with no jurisdiction or allies in Colorado territory, he eventually relented. On a crisp autumn day in 1876, Sophia Porter became Sophia Stone in a simple ceremony at the local church. She wore a dress of pale blue, her arms bare despite the scars, no longer symbols of shame but badges of survival. Matthew's parents stood witness, along with friends they had made in the nearby town. "Those scars only prove your strength," Matthew had said, and in time, Sophia had come to believe it. The stares and whispers that had followed her in San Antonio were absent here, where people valued grit and endurance over cosmetic perfection. And if anyone did notice, they had the good grace not to mention it. Life on the Stone Ranch settled into a rhythm of work and togetherness. Matthew took over more of the day-to-day operations as his father grew older, while Sophia found unexpected fulfillment in managing the household and helping with the accounts. She even returned to painting, encouraged by Mrs. Stone, who cleared a corner of the sitting room for an easel and supplies. Their first child, a son they named James after Matthew's father, arrived a year after their wedding. Their daughter, Lily, followed 2 years later. Both children grew up knowing their mother's story, an age-appropriate version, and understanding that the marks on her arms were part of who she was, but never all of who she was. News reached them occasionally of Gerald Porter. He had remarried, a young woman from a wealthy Austin family. Sophia prayed for the girl's safety, but knew that chapter of her life was closed. On the 10th anniversary of her arrival in Colorado, Matthew surprised her with a trip to California, fulfilling her childhood dream of seeing the ocean. They stood on the beach, waves lapping at their feet, their children building sand castles nearby. "Are you happy, Sophia?" he asked, his arm around her waist, his face lined now with a decade of sun and laughter. She looked up at him, this man who had seen her strength when everyone else saw only her scars. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. "No regrets," he pressed. "About leaving Texas, about the life we've built here?" "None," she said firmly. "This is where I was meant to be. With you, with our children, with this family we've created." He smiled, the same smile that had first given her hope in a dusty boarding house kitchen all those years ago. "Those scars only prove your strength," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And I've never known anyone stronger." Standing there with the vast Pacific before them and the solid ground of their shared life beneath their feet, Sophia knew it to be true. The scars remained, physical reminders of pain survived and overcome, but they no longer defined her. She was Sophia Stone, wife, mother, artist, survivor, and she was at last and completely free.